The sun beat down mercilessly on the red earth of Ouagadougou as a young Ibrahim Traoré stood at the edge of the military base, eyes fixed on the crumbling city beyond the gate. He was only 22, then barely out of university, barely into the army, yet something burned behind his gaze. Not ambition, not anger, but purpose. That rare force that can neither be taught nor inherited. It must be lived, suffered, carved into the soul by fire. Burkina Faso was unraveling. Extremist violence surged in the north, famine threatened the villages, and the government had become a ghost present in name but absent in action. In the barracks, soldiers murmured. On the streets, the people screamed in silence. What had once been pride in the homeland had turned into resignation. Yet even then, Ibrahim listened more than he spoke. He didn't shout with the others. He watched, he studied, and slowly he began to understand the system. Corruption wasn't a symptom, it was the design. By the time he was promoted to captain at 35, he had walked the blood-stained roads of Guibo, seen children orphaned by raids in the Sahel, and lead missions through villages forgotten by the state. In one of those villages, he had held a dying girl in his arms, a girl no older than his sister after a jihadist attack. Her last words were not in fear or pain. She asked him, "Will you stop them?" That question never left him. At night, under the bare bulb of his barrack room, he'd write in a small black notebook. Notes, names, patterns, alliances, betrayals. He was building something invisible to the outside world, an understanding of power and how to break it. He knew that Burkina Faso would not survive by elections, nor speeches, nor appeals to foreign aid. The tools of the colonizer were designed to protect the colonizer. The people needed something else. They needed disruption. And yet he waited because Traoré understood something else. Timing. The great mistake of most revolutionaries was impatience. They roared too early, exposed their plans, lost the momentum. He would not repeat that. So when the first coup came in, early 2022, toppling President Roch-Kabore, Traoré remained silent. It wasn't time. The man who took over, Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba, was hailed as a hero by some, but Traoré saw it immediately. A recycled page from the same book. Damiba wore a new uniform, but he walked in old shoes aligned with the West, slow to reform, blind to the ground realities. Then came the mistake. Damiba turned his back on the soldiers dying in the north. He protected elites in Ouaga while villages burned, and the murmurs returned not just among civilians now, but within the ranks. It was late September 2022 when the whisper began. Something is coming. Traoré is moving. He wasn't alone. A growing circle of junior officers had seen enough. They met quietly, no slogans, no banners, no manifestos, just a single goal: reclaim the revolution. Not with politics, but with precision. The night before the coup, Traoré visited his mother. She lived in a modest house on the outskirts of the capital, surrounded by clay walls and mango trees. He didn't tell her everything, but she knew. Mothers always know. "You're walking into fire," she said. "I was born in fire," he replied. October 1st, 2022. The gates of the national radio station exploded open. Armored vehicles rolled through the streets. Soldiers moved with discipline, not chaos. There was no looting, no wild gunfire, just swift control. Within hours, Damiba was removed. The flag changed. The power shifted, and at just 34 years old, Ibrahim Traoré.com/measured, steely-eyed, stood before the nation and declared, "We are taking our destiny into our own hands." There was no grand military parade, no theatrics, just a short speech. He promised transparency, security, dignity. He didn't beg for applause. He gave Burkina Faso something it hadn't felt in years: clarity. The world watched in stunned silence. In Paris, in Washington, in ICAO's headquarters, they scrambled for explanations. How had a junior officer, unknown just a year before, taken control of a nation? The answer was simple. He had listened when others had spoken. He had acted when others hesitated. And most of all, he hadn't feared the cost. But the coup was only the beginning. 2 days later, a convoy was ambushed in the north. Over a dozen soldiers killed. Traoré flew there personally, not to inspect, to bury them. One by one, he placed a hand on each coffin. When asked why, he answered, "I don't send anyone where I won't go myself." This was no empty gesture. It was a declaration of war against the enemies outside the nation and the enemies within. The cartels, the corrupt contractors, the foreign advisors who lived in hotels while children bled on dust roads. He made it clear Burkina Faso would no longer be a playground for global interests. 1 week later, French troops were ordered out of the country. The embassy denied it. The press mocked him, but Traoré didn't blink. In a midnight operation, his men blocked access to the French military compound. Helicopters grounded. Convoys stopped. He didn't fire a shot. He just made it known this land belongs to its people, and something remarkable began to happen. Across Africa, in Mali, in Niger, in Congo, in Guinea, young people began chanting his name, not as a messiah, as a mirror. Because in Traoré, they saw themselves, ones who had been told they were too poor, too small, too unimportant to matter. He was proof that agency didn't need permission. He was the captain who chose his people over power. But not everyone celebrated. Sanctions came swiftly. Western media painted him as another strongman. Funds were frozen, pressures mounted. Foreign diplomats demanded answers. But Traoré remained unshaken. He replied only with action. He launched agrarian reforms, redirected military focus to community defense, and began building local alliances that bypassed the usual gatekeepers. His strategy wasn't just military, it was cultural, psychological, symbolic. He restored the portraits of Sankara in schools, he walked through markets without bodyguards, he listened to Griot sing, and he asked elders for advice, and every night, he returned to that same black notebook. Still writing? Still watching? Still learning, because Traoré knew what the world hadn't figured out yet. This wasn't about Burkina Faso alone. It was about the rebirth of African sovereignty from the ground up, and that fire. It had only just begun to burn. The streets of Ouagadougou were tense, buzzing with whispers of change. Smoke still hung in the air from burnt tires, and the scent of resistance mingled with dust and diesel. But behind the veils of uncertainty, one thing was becoming clear. Something unprecedented was unfolding in the heart of Burkina Faso, and at the center of it stood a 34-year-old captain with a piercing gaze and an uncompromising vision. Ibrahim Traoré. Only months earlier, Traoré had been a little-known officer in the Burkinabé army, but now, his name echoed in every alley, in every conversation, both feared and revered. How had this young man, once a geologist by training, now become the most powerful figure in a country teetering between hope and collapse? Traoré wasn't born into privilege. Raised in Bonakai, a rural town, far from the political elite, his early years were defined by simplicity and struggle. His family, like millions of others, worked hard to get by living through the economic uncertainty, political instability, and rising insecurity that gripped Burkina Faso after decades of post-colonial turbulence. But even then, those close to him saw something unusual in young Ibrahim. He devoured books, especially those about African history and revolutionaries. Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Amilcar Cabral. These weren't just names to him, they were blueprints. He studied their paths, absorbed their words, and carried them like weapons in his mind. By the time he enrolled in university to study geology, he was already a quiet agitator, not in the streets, but in thought. He would challenge professors in debates, question colonial narratives, and dissect the failures of successive African leaders. Yet it wasn't anger that drove him. It was a deep, burning sense of justice, the belief that Burkina Faso, and Africa as a whole, had been robbed of its dignity. Still, few imagined he would join the military, and fewer still thought he would rise. His decision to enlist wasn't fueled by patriotism alone, it was strategic. He believed real change in a country plagued by coups and armed insurgency could only be born from within the very structures that controlled it. If you wanted to reclaim a hijacked nation, you had to understand and eventually command its levers of power. So Traoré entered the army with discipline, patience, and an unusually sharp political mind. He climbed the ranks quietly, gaining the respect of his peers not just for his competence, but for his clarity. In an army often divided along ethnic or regional lines, he was different. He didn't seek alliances through blood or tribe. He earned loyalty through principle, but it was on the battlefield that his myths began to take shape. In 2022, the jihadist insurgency was at its peak. Entire regions of Burkina Faso had fallen to militants. Schools were closed, roads unsafe, civilians massacred. The central government, overwhelmed and often paralyzed, struggled to respond effectively. Amid this chaos, Traoré distinguished himself in a series of bold counteroffensives, particularly in the north. He led from the front, literally. While many officers gave commands from distant posts, Traoré was known to ride with his men into the most dangerous zones. He slept in the same barracks, ate the same rations, and refused any special treatment. To the soldiers under his command, he was more than a leader, he was one of them. And as rumors of his courage spread, so did his influence. Young officers, frustrated with the political leadership, began to gravitate toward him. They saw in him not only a tactical commander, but a symbol of something they desperately lacked: vision, where others offered vague promises. Traoré spoke of a liberated Burkina Faso, one that controlled its own resources, expelled foreign manipulation, and restored dignity to its people. By September 2022, the powder keg was primed. The interim government, which had come to power after a previous coup just months earlier, was losing support rapidly. It had failed to halt the insurgency, and whispers of foreign interference in internal affairs began to swirl. Confidence was eroding, and into this vacuum stepped the captain. On the morning of September 30th, gunfire echoed through the capital. In what would become known as one of the most rapid and surgical power shifts in the country's history, Traoré and a small group of loyal officers seized control. There was no prolonged battle, no drawn-out civil clash. It was swift, decisive, almost theatrical. The old leader fled. The military command pledged allegiance to the new, but it wasn't the takeover that shocked the world. It was the man. Behind it, Burkinabé citizens, weary of broken promises and international manipulation, poured into the streets, not in protest, but in celebration. They hoisted Traoré's image into the air, chanting his name like a prophet returned. It was a sight that defied Western expectations. After all, how could a young officer, unknown on the world stage, garner such fierce devotion overnight? The answer lay in one word: Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary martyr, assassinated in 1987, had become a spiritual blueprint for change. And Traoré, both in rhetoric and symbolism, invoked his legacy constantly. He dressed simply, rejected luxuries, and even refused to reside in the presidential palace. To many, he was Sankara reborn, not in body, but in mission. But was it merely performance? International media scrambled to understand him. Was he a populist strongman in disguise? A nationalist with an anti-Western agenda? Or something rarer, a genuine believer in African sovereignty and justice? The truth was more complex. In his early addresses, Traoré didn't mince words. He accused Western powers of neo-colonial exploitation, criticized the role of France in the Sahel, and called for a new Pan-African awakening. Yet he also emphasized unity, discipline, and reform from within. He promised to clean up corruption, rebuild the military, and reclaim security without becoming a tyrant. Critics, however, remained skeptical. Could a young, untested officer really govern a fractured nation? And how would he balance revolutionary zeal with the grim realities of geopolitics? Traoré didn't offer easy answers, but he did something rarer. He acted. Within weeks of taking power, he expelled French military forces stationed in the country. He revoked mining contracts that he claimed exploited local resources. He restructured the National Army Command and launched community-based security initiatives aimed at empowering rural populations. And above all, he made himself visible. Unlike many African leaders who disappeared behind palace walls after seizing power, Traoré toured the country constantly. He met with displaced villagers, slept in forward operating bases, and even took part in local forums where farmers and teachers voiced concerns directly to him. To some, it was political theater, but to millions of Burkinabé it was unprecedented leadership. Yet every revolution faces its reckoning. And as international pressure mounted, insurgent attacks continued, and internal factions questioned his decisions. One question began to loom over Ibrahim Traoré's rise. Would he endure as a liberator, or be consumed by the very system he vowed to destroy? The answer was still unwritten. But one thing was certain: for the first time in decades, the people of Burkina Faso believed again, not in illusions, but in the possibility of something radically different. And as the sun set over Ouagadougou that day, casting long shadows across the bullet-scarred walls of the capital, the silhouette of a young captain remained etched in the minds of a nation unbending, unflinching, and unafraid. The sun beat down on the dust-covered streets of Ouagadougou as Captain Ibrahim Traoré returned to the city he now governed, not as a conqueror, but as a protector. Unlike other leaders who ascended to power with gold-lined uniforms and empty slogans, Traoré's boots were still caked with the red soil of the Sahel. His military fatigues were wrinkled from long days in the field, and his eyes, though sharp with intelligence, bore the fatigue of responsibility. His arrival at the capital was met with neither fanfare nor ceremony, just silence. A silence full of anticipation. Crowds slowly gathered, cautiously at first. Elders stood beside youths, and mothers lifted their children onto their shoulders, to catch a glimpse of the man who had dared to challenge not only the corrupt regime of Burkina Faso, but the tangled web of foreign interference in Africa. With a simple wave, Traoré acknowledged them not with arrogance, but with humility. For him, this was never about power. It was about liberation. Behind closed doors, however, a storm was brewing. As Traoré stepped into the presidential palace, a building he had once walked past as a cadet, never imagining he would command it, was immediately clear that his revolution was only just beginning. Ministers, advisors, and diplomats lined up to greet him, some with forced smiles, others with thinly veiled disdain. Traoré saw through it all. The air was thick with hidden agendas. Some wanted to manipulate him, others to destroy him, but none could ignore him. In his first official address as head of state, he did not speak of personal triumph. He spoke of sovereignty, of justice, of Africa rising from its knees. "We will no longer be the footstool of empires," he declared, voice unwavering. "Burkina Faso belongs to its people, not to foreign interests, not to oligarchs, not to those who trade security for exploitation." The hall erupted into applause, but the world outside that room was not clapping. Within weeks of taking power, Traoré became the target of relentless campaigns. International news agencies labeled him a radical. Analysts accused him of destabilizing the region. Western diplomats issued veiled threats disguised as press releases. Sanctions loomed. Offers of aid arrived, laced with conditions. But Traoré would not kneel. Instead, he turned his attention to the battlefield, where the real test awaited him. Burkina Faso was bleeding. Terrorist groups had carved the country into zones of fear. Villages were burned. Farmers fled their lands. Children were being raised in refugee camps, their laughter replaced with silence. No leader in recent memory had succeeded in halting the tide. But Traoré wasn't just another leader. He traveled to the front lines not in a convoy of luxury vehicles, but in an armored pickup, flanked by soldiers whose eyes burned with the same fire as his. He ate with them, slept beside them, and listened. Not as a general giving orders, but as a man learning from his brothers in arms. One night, by the flickering light of a campfire, Traoré gathered a group of commanders. They were tired, supplies were low, morale was cracking. He didn't promise miracles. Instead, he pulled from his pocket a tattered notebook, a diary his father once kept during his days as a miner. It contained handwritten notes about struggle, hunger, sacrifice, and hope. My father didn't fight with guns, Traoré told them, but he fought with dignity. He endured exploitation. He labored in darkness so I could walk in the light. Now, it's our turn to fight for our families, our land, and our future. The silence that followed was more powerful than any speech. The next morning they launched a counteroffensive village by village, stronghold by stronghold. The armed forces, rejuvenated under Traoré's leadership, began to reclaim territory. Farmers returned to their fields, school doors opened again. A nation, once sinking into despair, began to breathe. But with every victory came a new challenge. Traoré's stance against French military presence had made headlines worldwide, a move that shook geopolitical foundations. He demanded the withdrawal of foreign troops from Burkinabe soil. To some, it was a bold declaration of independence. To others, it was a death sentence. Yet Traoré remained firm. How can we call ourselves free if our skies are patrolled by foreign drones and our borders guarded by those who serve others' interests? This decision was not without risk. In the following weeks, intelligence reports indicated increased foreign surveillance. Several assassination plots were uncovered. One involved a convoy ambush on a remote highway Traoré was scheduled to pass. At the last moment, he changed course, not out of fear, but instinct. Some called it luck, others, destiny. In response, Traoré reinforced his security network, not with foreign contractors, but with elite Burkinabe units trained under his command. He formed alliances with neighboring Sahel countries, establishing a regional force free from Western oversight. It was a new kind of diplomacy, African to African, soldier to soldier. Meanwhile, in the capital, whispers of a coup began to circulate. Some factions within the military, backed by old political elites, began to question Traoré's vision. They saw his rejection of international aid as suicidal. His embrace of Pan-Africanism, they claimed, would isolate Burkina Faso. But Traoré didn't flinch. He addressed the rumors directly in a televised speech. If defending our dignity makes me your enemy, then so be it. I will not trade sovereignty for comfort. I will not betray the blood spilled by our ancestors for the illusion of peace. These words echoed across the continent. From Dakar to Kinshasa, from Khartoum to Johannesburg, African youth saw something in Traoré they had longed for, a leader unshackled by colonial guilt, a man not molded in Western think tanks, but forged in the crucible of African soil. Social media erupted with messages of support. Murals of Traoré began appearing in the favelas of Lagos. On walls in the suburbs of Nairobi, he became a symbol of war, but of dignity. Yet amid this rising wave of support, Traoré remained grounded. He continued to live simply, refused luxury, refused to move into the presidential residence. "How can I sleep in a palace?" he once asked. "When my people sleep under tarps." He directed funds to rebuilding hospitals, restocking clinics, and repairing war-torn schools. Each gesture, though small, echoed louder than speeches. But every revolution faces its crucible. In late 2023, a series of attacks rocked the north. Coordinated assaults by multiple insurgent factions left dozens dead. Intelligence suggested external funding was involved. The message was clear. Traoré's resistance was making powerful enemies. Rather than retreat, he called a national assembly. Tribal leaders, imams, priests, union heads, and local activists gathered in the capital. He stood before them, not as a ruler, but as a servant. "I cannot rebuild this nation alone," he said. "But together, we can do what generations before us dreamed of, build a Burkina Faso that bows to no one." The room erupted not just in applause, but in tears. They knew the path ahead would be perilous, but they also knew they were no longer alone. Under the flickering lights of the conference hall, as the storm of geopolitics raged outside, a new Burkina Faso was being born, not with guns or slogans, but with unity. And at the center of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré, defiant and unbreakable. Night fell heavy over Ouagadougou, not the tranquil darkness of a resting city, but a loaded silence. Somewhere beyond the capital's edges, insurgents were mobilizing. In the presidential compound, still modest, still guarded by men in worn fatigues, Ibrahim Traoré stood alone by the window, overlooking a city on the brink. He wasn't just leading a government. He was holding back chaos with willpower and grit. And deep inside he knew, this wasn't just Burkina Faso's war. It was Africa's reckoning. The stakes were climbing. Burkina Faso's economy, already fragile, was now under siege. Sanctions and blockades came dressed as diplomacy. Western banks froze funds. Development loans evaporated overnight. NGOs began packing up. The international community claimed concern over democratic regression, but Traoré saw through the rhetoric. He knew this wasn't about governance, it was about obedience, and he had chosen not to obey. One morning, a leaked memo surfaced. A high-ranking diplomat, during a closed meeting, had called Traoré a dangerous example. The word spread like wildfire. But rather than hide from the label, Traoré embraced it. If protecting our dignity is dangerous, then yes, I am dangerous, he told a crowd in Bobo Dioulasso, standing beneath a crumbling archway built by colonial hands. And I will not apologize for it. That same week, hundreds of young men and women volunteered to join the new civilian defense brigades. Teachers, farmers, mechanics, students. They came in droves. Not because they loved war, but because they believed in what Traoré represented, the right to stand tall. But the more ground Traoré gained at home, the more enemies he awakened abroad. In Paris, Washington, Brussels strategists began to worry. Burkina Faso was small, yes. Poor, yes. But ideas, they knew, were viral. And what Traoré was planting wasn't just rebellion. It was self. If Burkina Faso could chart its path, others might follow. The dominoes could fall from Mali to Niger, to Chad, to Congo. Africa, long considered a playground for foreign interests, might finally reclaim the game. And so, pressure intensified. Offers were made quietly, lavish aid packages, military equipment, infrastructure deals, but always with strings. Traoré refused. What they call aid is a leash, he told his cabinet, and I will not be walked. Some ministers urged compromise. The country was hurting, inflation soared, fuel shortages loomed, but Traoré stood firm. The pain we feel now is the labor of birth, he said. The pain they offer is anesthesia before enslavement. To many in the West, his words were inflammatory, but to millions in Africa, they were oxygen. Pan-African movements surged. In Dakar, students wore shirts bearing Traoré's face, above the words L'Afrique s'est livrée. In Nairobi, musicians wrote songs honoring his defiance. In Bam, children painted murals of him beside Sankara and Lumumba. Traoré, once a shadow in Burkina's military, had become a myth in motion. But myths don't protect against missiles. In December, an intelligence report confirmed what Traoré had long suspected: foreign operatives were aiding rebel factions. Not officially, not openly, but unmistakably. Weapons intercepted in the north bore serial numbers from suppliers linked to foreign governments. Communications were traced, money trails uncovered. The enemy wasn't just internal anymore. This was proxy war. In response, Traoré made a decision that would echo across continents. He closed the last remaining foreign military outpost in the country. No more advisors, no more drones, no more partnerships. Burkina Faso would defend itself for fall trying. International media exploded. Headlines screamed of authoritarianism, of recklessness, of collapse. Analysts predicted his downfall within weeks. But on the ground, in the dirt and sweat of real people, the story was different. Local defense units, trained under Traoré's doctrine, pushed insurgents back. Villagers who once fled returned home. Schools reopened in zones that had been silent for years, and something else began to stir. Regional unity. Traoré reached out to Mali, Niger, and Guinea nations, walking a similar path of defiance. In a historic summit held without a single Western observer, the Alliance of Sahel Sovereignty was born. A pact not just of military cooperation, but of ideological brotherhood. They divide us to weaken us, Traoré said during the summit, but united, even our scars become armor. Still, inside the heart of the revolution, a new battle was forming. Fatigue, not on the front lines, but in the people. Years of violence, poverty, and tension were taking their toll. Some began to ask, when does struggle end? When does rebuilding begin? And could one man really deliver it all? Traoré too was haunted by these questions. Late at night, in the quiet of his study, he'd stare at maps of a broken country. His desk bore no presidential seal, only a photograph of his mother, a woman who once sold vegetables in a roadside stall. She used to tell him, the one who dares to plant must also dare to water. And so, he did. Traoré launched a series of community projects, not glamorous, not televised, but real. He visited rural clinics, sat with grieving mothers, stood in line for food rations with the people, not as a stunt. As a citizen, you lead better when you serve, he often said. These actions didn't make international headlines, but they rewrote the local narrative. Soon, something unexpected began to happen. Opposition leaders, some exiled, some silenced, started returning. Traoré welcomed them. No arrests, no revenge. Just one condition: loyalty to the people, not to old regimes. The move shocked his critics. You trust them? One advisor asked. Traoré replied, I trust that they've felt the same pain, and maybe now, they're ready to build. It was a gamble, but one that paid off. In January, for the first time in years, a national peace forum was held. Different tribes, religions, and political factions sat under one roof, not to argue, but to listen. Traoré didn't dominate the stage. He opened it. Let Burkina Faso speak, he said, then took a seat. Old rivals shook hands, Past enemies found common ground. A ceasefire was declared in regions once thought lost. And above all, hope cautious, fragile, but real took root. Yet beyond the borders, fury simmered. International observers dismissed the peace forum as symbolic theater. Think tanks released reports labeling Traoré a populist threat. Cyber attacks targeted government systems. One night, unknown drones flew over sensitive military zones, probing, watching. The message was clear. Someone wanted the experiment to fail. But Traoré had come too far to yield. In a speech that would later be carved in marble at a memorial site, he addressed his nation. They fear us not because we are powerful, but because we are becoming free. Free minds, free lands, free people. And freedom, brothers and sisters, is louder than any bomb. The crowd that day stretched for miles. Not out of obligation, out of belief. But belief, alone, cannot shield a country. In March, coordinated attack hit the border town of Gorom. Over 70 civilians killed, dozens kidnapped. Evidence pointed to a coalition of insurgent groups with backing from outside. Traoré's response was swift but measured. He mobilized a joint task force with Niger and Mali, not just to retaliate but to rescue. And in a daring overnight operation, captives were freed. For many, it was a miracle. For Traoré, it was simply duty. Yet even as victories stacked, so did threats. A top advisor was poisoned, survived, but barely. An arms shipment was sabotaged. A cyberattack knocked out communications in the north. The war was no longer just in the bush, it was in the shadows, in the wires, in the water. And still, Traoré stood tall. Let them come, he said in a private briefing. We do not fear monsters when we know we are men. But the weight was visible, now in his shoulders, in his voice. Friends began to worry. Was the burden becoming too great? Could one man resist the machinery of global power? And if he fell, what would follow? That question lingered like smoke. As the sun rose over the red earth, Traoré looked out once more across the capital. A nation healing, a people awakening, and a revolution still unfinished. He knew the next phase would be the hardest. Not the war against guns, but the war for memory. Because someday, history would try to reshape him into a tyrant, or a saint, or a footnote. But for now, he was simply a man standing, breathing, resisting, and the world was watching. The rain that night came without warning, heavy, relentless, almost symbolic. It washed through the streets of Ouagadougou like a cleansing flood, soaking banners, dissolving chalk protests scrawled across walls, and pounding on the metal roofs of a city half rebuilt and half broken. In the presidential compound, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone. No guards in the room, no cameras, just silence. And a letter, not typed, handwritten, delivered through back channels. Its message was short: stand down or be removed. He read it once, then again, then folded it neatly, slipped it into his drawer, and lit a cigarette. He rarely smoked, only when it was war. Something was shifting. He could feel it. The crowd still chanted his name. The mural still glowed with his image. But behind the slogans, something quieter had begun creeping in. Fear, exhaustion, whispers of betrayal. The war outside had forced you in España, but as the gunfire quieted, old ambitions reawakened. Inside his cabinet, cracks began to show. Some ministers, once loyal, now flirted with foreign diplomats behind closed doors. Promises were whispered: safe exile, of luxurious exile, of peace in exchange for surrender. Others spoke of elections, of restoring legitimacy, of rebuilding trust with the international community. The same community that had armed rebels and starved villages listened. But inside, he was drawing lines. He wasn't afraid of elections. He had no thirst for eternal rule. But he knew how easily power could be handed to puppets. And he knew this struggle wasn't about his image. It was about memory. About whether Africa would remember how to stand down or be taught, once again, how to kneel. In a speech delivered under gray skies, he laid his cards bare. I did not come to reign. I came to remind you what freedom tastes like. If tomorrow I vanish, let that taste remain in your mouths. Bitter, unforgettable. The world held its breath. Rumors of an impending coup circulated through diplomatic channels. Leaked cables described Traoré as increasingly paranoid. Analysts debated his sanity. Others questioned his resolve. But what none could deny was the impact. Burkina Faso had changed. Satellite images showed villages once abandoned, now glowing with light. Roads once fractured, now reconnected. For the first time in a decade, the country's north was accessible without armed escort. Clinics reopened. Schools buzzed. Life, fragile but undeniable, was returning. And yet, peace came with a strange side effect. Revision. Suddenly, voices emerged claiming Traoré had done too little, that the revolution had lost direction, that perhaps he had been too radical, or not radical enough, or simply wrong altogether. He smiled when he heard it. They've begun rewriting me, he told his brother one night. That means I've begun to matter. But there were other warnings, sharper ones. A convoy transporting food aid to Dori was bombed. The attackers weren't rebels, they were trained, precise. Their escape route, well mapped. One survivor described the accents foreign, not African French. Perhaps. American, maybe. No one claimed responsibility. Weeks later, plane carrying 2 ministers crashed on its descent into Ben. The investigation was sealed, black box unrecovered. Traoré didn't speak publicly, but those closest to him saw the change. The man who once walked into war zones now traveled only at night. His inner circle shrank. Trust became rare currency. In that tight circle was a young woman, Necha Dembele, a journalist, once arrested for criticizing him, now one of his closest advisors. She had challenged him in an open letter. We do not need saviors, we need servants. Instead of silencing her, he hired her. One night, she asked him the question that haunted millions. Do you think you'll survive this? He didn't hesitate. No, but that's not the point. She pressed. Then what is it? He looked at her calm, tired, unshaken. That something survives me. Because in truth, Ibrahim Traoré had never intended to be eternal. He wasn't building a dynasty, he was building a spark. A matchstick to light a fire across a continent still drenched in the oil of dependency. But fires attract enemies. In early April, a strange illness swept through a base in Kaya. Soldiers collapsed, hallucinated. 3 died, all water sources tested clean. Yet traces of synthetic toxins were found in their systems. The origin? Unknown. The timing? Not a coincidence. That same week, international media published a series of exposés, anonymous testimonies accusing Traoré of disappearances, secret prisons, and abuses. No evidence was provided, just sensational headlines. Western embassies began evacuating non-essential staff. Flights in and out of Burkina became scarce. It was the storm before the strike. On the night of April 17th, drones lit up the skies above Ouagadougou. Gunfire rang through the capital. Armored vehicles moved toward key radio towers. The internet went dark. Rumors swirled. The coup had begun. But Traoré was ready. He had anticipated the betrayal not from outside, but from within. Men he had once promoted now turned against him, but the people hadn't, and that made all the difference. As the traitors approached the main broadcast station, they were ambushed not by soldiers, but by civilians, teachers, butchers, young women with hunting rifles, old men with machetes. The uprising wasn't from above, it was from below. By dawn, the coup was crushed. Over 40 conspirators were arrested. Some fled, some vanished. The rest exposed on live television, not humiliated, but confronted. Why? Traoré asked one of them, a former general. After all we endured, why? The man said nothing, just looked away. Traoré turned to the camera. Let this be the last time brothers kill brothers for foreign coins. But victory came at a cost. The attempted coup had fractured the last threads of diplomacy. Aid was suspended indefinitely, assets frozen, sanctions tightened, media attacks intensified. Burkina Faso, they said, was now a rogue state, and in a sense, they were right. It was rogue against oppression, against control, against the idea that Africans must always be told what's best for them. Traoré embraced the label. In a conference held in the ruins of a former French garrison, he stood beside leaders from Mali, Niger, Guinea, and the Central African Republic. Together, they declared the birth of a new coalition, l'Union des Nations Libres, not just military, but monetary. They proposed a new currency, a new bank, a new bloc. Let them isolate us, Traoré said. We are not afraid of their silence. We are afraid of forgetting our own voice. It was bold, audacious, perhaps unrealistic, but it was real. And for the first time, Africa was speaking on its own terms. Still, the dangers remained, not just external, but internal. Power corrupts, even in revolution, and Traoré knew that. More, he became a symbol. The easier it would be to rot beneath the surface, so he began planning his exit quietly. He didn't want to die a martyr, or rule like a king. He wanted to leave before the fire burned him too. Acha noticed the signs papers being signed in the dark. Succession plans whispered in closed circles. Reforms passed that transferred executive power to elected councils. One night, she asked him, when he smiled, when the memory is stronger than the man, and then, he vanished. Not officially. No public farewell, no parade, just gone, like a ghost slipping into the wind. Some say he fled to the north. Others claim he joined a rebel brigade to fight undercover. A few believe he died quietly in a hospital under an alias, but none of it was confirmed. Instead, what remained was legend. Children recite his speeches in classrooms. Streets bear his name. Songs praise him. Murals bloom across walls from to Addis Ababa. In the Sahel, fighters carry his quotes on their rifles. In the UN, his face is burned into every uncomfortable silence about colonial legacy. But most powerful of all was, what didn't happen? Burkina Faso did not collapse. In fact, it stabilized. A new leader elected months later stood on a platform built by Traoré's reforms, not a general, not a foreign favorite. A school teacher from Koudougou, a woman, her campaign slogan, "We remember." The economy grew. Slowly but surely, regional alliances deepened, and the phrase Traoré gamble became shorthand in academic circles for a new model of resistance, one based not on vengeance, but on memory. The West, confused and cornered, chose silence. And Ibrahim Traoré, He remained nowhere and everywhere. Some say he walks among the gold mines, disguised as a worker. Others claim he lives by a river, raising goats, watching the world he helped shape from a distance. One child swears he saw him in a marketplace, buying oranges. When asked what he looked like, the child said, like someone who had finally rested. And maybe that was the point all along. To not just fight, but finish. To not just lead, but leave. To not just live in history, but rewrite it.